Welcome to another Telltale Books video. I'm Greg and I'm here to talk about a topic this time. And that topic is a very recent, maybe not too recent, but a relatively recent development in publishing and the genre, which has recently been termed Romantasy. Now, I've been doing a small number of reviews of Romantasy books, mainly because I've been reading them with my good friend Samantha, who really loves the genre. She loves traditional romance novels, um, and she loves books that have a fair amount of adult spice to them. And she's gotten me curious about some of what she's been reading, and I've also agreed to read some of it with her. So I have been reading some of this stuff, and I've discovered two things in doing this. First of all, no, this isn't one of the two things I've discovered, but this genre is not primarily what I want to be reading. It's something I'm doing mainly just because a friend is doing it, and I got curious. I wanted to see what it was all about. And as somebody with a channel like Telltale Books, that, we're not just science fiction, we are looking to explore all of literature, including nonfiction. Emily has done a number of nonfiction book reviews, and she has done some poetry readings. So we'll cover poetry, we'll cover literary fiction. Um, we'll get into all the different genres. I have done small number of mysteries, mainly Agatha Christie, who I fell in love with her work when I gave it a try. So, we're not just a science fiction channel. You need to understand we are more than that. We are bigger than that. And the reason that I came to that, when I was young, I wouldn't read anything but science fiction. Don't even hand me fantasy, don't hand me horror, don't hand me Stephen King. It's not science fiction. I didn't want to read it. And I only gradually grew out of that. I'm sorry, I'm going to put it that way. It is growth. I did grow up and realize that science fiction stories are different from literary fiction and different from fantasy and different from horror in most cases. But just because something isn't science fiction doesn't mean it isn't good. Stories are stories. There are certain things about all stories that need to be there to make them compelling. A lot of times science fiction lacks some of those things, and that drives a lot of people today crazy. But um, if you enjoy reading stories, then just because there aren't any spaceships or robots doesn't mean it isn't any good. You may pick it up and read it and find yourself really enthralled with it. I know I did the first time. Well, it was in high school. Well, actually junior high school. Reading Romeo and Juliet. I found it to be really cool. I liked it. It wasn't science fiction, it wasn't fantasy, but it was really good. And it was actually that romance stuff, but it was still really good. It had sword fights and suicides, and it was pretty intense. I really, really liked Romeo and Juliet. And then later on in high school, I read books like Of Mice and Men and The Grapes of Wrath and The Old Man and the Sea, and found out that I really liked those stories. I read The Scarlet Letter and I liked that. So by being told to try those things, I tried them and found out I really liked them. To Kill a Mockingbird was another one I read in school, and it just blew me away. It's a great book. It's an enjoyable book. even though it isn't science fiction, fantasy, or horror, I still found a lot of the same excitement that I got from the books that I normally read. There just weren't any spaceships, no time travel. But those are just plot devices to take you to where characters encounter the things that are going to change them. That's the point. And you can find you can find similar kinds of plot devices in the real world. So works of fiction don't have to be science fiction to be really fun to read or really great literature. And the same could be said of any other genre. And just because you pick up Zane Grey and it has horses and shotguns, that doesn't mean it's not going to be a compelling story. And romance, just because a romance book, first of all, is marketed towards women. So if you're a guy like me, tends to not be what you want to read. But that doesn't mean these books aren't good, compelling books. You know, they just happen to have some sex scenes in them, and the sex scenes are from the point of view of women, what women want. Some women would say us guys need to learn that. I don't know. But I do know that as a channel that purports to talk about all books and try to find the best among all books, we can't take an entire genre and say, this we don't want to cover. We're not going to touch that. You know, especially even if I was wanting to keep this just to speculative fiction, fantasy, science fiction, horror, these books are fantasy. No, they're not Lord of the Rings. And there's been a lot of talk lately about how that high epic fantasy like Lord of the Rings, that publishers don't want to publish those big fantasy series. They want standalones and they want stuff that's shorter. I don't think it's so much attention span that drives that as the fact that while there are a lot of people that love those 1,000-page books that are one of 12 such books in a series, there are other people that they're not sure they want to invest in that. The price of that great big book, the amount of time it takes to read that great big book, what if you don't like it? And certainly you don't want to, well, you don't want to get into a Game of Thrones situation where the last book still isn't written years later. There's always that fear with big fantasy series that the author isn't going to bother finishing it and leave you high and dry. And there's the further issue of just the cost of books. Most people are not spending thousands of dollars a year on books. Most people are buying a few books a year, and they really don't want to. When you get into a series, you feel committed to stick to that series through the whole thing. It's hard to get into a series and only read the first book and stop. It's really hard to do that. But psychologically, you want to keep going. But a lot of people just don't want that. They want a one and done book. There have been a lot of books that are standalone, even in the fantasy genre. Although Romantasy does seem to have seriesitis and does seem to get into the really big, long books, it's not the same kind of epic fantasy that you get with Lord of the Rings or Brandon Sanderson. It's just different. And that's the thing to remember. It's different. It's the themes and stories that let's face it, the majority of readers, the majority of book buyers right now are young women. And that's what they want. They want the spice, they want the romance, they want the characters, they want the friends, but they also want some dragons and some magic in with it. And therefore, the romantasy field has been born. Now, you could probably argue forever over just where romantasy starts. At the very least, I think you could trace it all the way back to myths like Tristan and Isolde in the medieval times, possibly even some of the Greek myths. There's a lot of that right now, a lot of books that are very much like the Romantasy books, but what they are is retellings of Greek and Norse myths into a modern fantasy book, and they add some spice to it, and those have become super popular as well. Although I think that's arguably a little separate genre from the Romantasy genre. Um, but certainly the idea of these romantic, fantastic stories does at least go back to medieval times in stories like Tristan and Isolde. And of course, when you get into the Gothic age, the works of Anne Radcliffe, you have the beginnings of the Gothic romance, which would lead to books like Wuthering Heights and Jane Eyre. And a lot of people will scold you for calling those romance books. Because even though there's relationships between man and woman going on in these books, they don't really fit what we call today romance. But you need to remember, in the 1800s, Romanticism was something very different. Romanticism was Frankenstein. Romanticism was the Castle of Otranto. Romanticism was all of the very emotional types of stories that brought in elements of the supernatural. They were not all love stories. So Frankenstein is actually a work of romanticism. It's a work of Gothic literature, but it's definitely not romantasy. Wuthering Heights is closer, much closer. Doesn't have as much spice as today's romantasy, but it's much, much closer. It has an element of the supernatural. It just doesn't go off into fairy kingdoms. Later on, of course, in the 60s and 70s, you had a lot of Gothic romances, the books with the woman running from the castle on a windy night. That was a very big thing back then, and definitely a precursor to romantasy. Even though, again, you don't have fairy kingdoms, you don't have dragons, you don't have all the trappings of modern fantasy stories going on. You just have this Gothic feel. In the 1990s, I believe it was, you had series like Twilight coming out, which was romance aimed at young adults, but it was pretty heavy romance, and there was a lot of supernatural in it with the vampires and werewolves. Still different from what we're calling romantasy today, but you could say that's kind of the beginnings in our current time of what would lead to romantasy. From there, I think you can argue um, there are a number of authors that wrote those kind of supernatural romances starting in the 1980s and continuing to today, like Heather Graham, Laurel Hamilton. And you could call them precursors. You could call Anne Rice a precursor, but they're still usually dealing with more traditional Gothic type stories, just very modernized. The first time you really get into something that I think today's readers would qualify as romantasy is with Sarah J. Maas and her Throne of Glass series. Well, technically it started with the novellas that are now collected into The Assassin's Blade. These are all prequel stories to Throne of Glass. And in these, there are romantic relationships going on. That is a big part of the stories, but there isn't, so far at least, I'm into Heir of Fire, and there isn't any single big romance continuing through it. Ceylana has a number of romantic relationships. So I really feel these stories are very heavy on the fantasy and action and adventure, and lighter on the romance. The next to come along, of course, was A Court of Thorns and Roses, which took the um, the fairy tale of which of course took the fairy tale of the Beauty and the Beast and recast it in a new form, in a romantic fantasy. And it is very much fantasy and romance, but it's important to note that it is a retelling of a classic fairy tale. So the fairy tale and a lot of other fairy tales like Sleeping Beauty and Snow White and Cinderella, they've been around for a very, very long time. And they are basically romanticities. They are romance stories with fantastic elements to them. And so to take Beauty and the Beast and redo it as A Court of Thorns and Roses was not a huge stretch of the imagination. But the important thing about it is that it really connected with a lot of young women mainly, and really drove the creation of a whole new genre, romantasy. Now, and so she followed that up with a number of other books, 5 of them to date. A Court of Mist and Fury was the second one, and in this one she stepped out. Court of Thorns and Roses is still acceptable as a YA book. With A Court of Mist and Fury, you've got something that has some very adult descriptions of sexual encounters going on, and these stories are not necessarily the kind of erotic romance that leaves a positive impression on people. There's a lot of male domination. There's a lot of flat out rape. Some slavery, some sexual slavery scenes going on. It gets pretty deep and pretty graphic in the erotic themes, and gets into things that you don't want to teach young girls, that this is a good thing, that this is a positive thing, that these are heroes. And that's the danger of these books, to show these guys that are these big, strong, fighting men that take their women and put them in their place and capture them and force them to do this and that. To present that image as a heroic, positive image is a bad thing, which is where a lot of people's concerns are kind of coming in with these books. And of course, the concern that, Throne of Glass, so far, I've read 3 of the books. I'm on my 4th. I'm well into my 4th, halfway through Heir of Fire. They're totally appropriate for teenagers, totally appropriate for high schools. Put it in your school library, no big deal. Nothing in there that I would object to. And even with A Court of Thorns and Roses, you're still not getting too bad Start getting a little more adult, but it doesn't get really explicit. But in A Court of Mist and Fury, you start getting explicit. You start getting explicit sex and all, and that's an issue a lot of people have raised about this. Is it did start out as YA, and Sarah J. Maas was being put in the YA section. And then she published Court of Mist and Fury, which is definitely not YA, but because of her previous reputation, she was still being put there. And no, 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 no. This is not a book you want in your high school. This is not a book you want in your school libraries. Okay, it's it's adult. It's definitely adult. I mean, I don't want to be a prude, or or say that censorship is good, but I mean, you're talking about school libraries. There's a line you got to draw. How explicit do you want to put in there? They can discover that stuff when they're adults if they like it or not. It's not really something they need to be reading when they're in high school or junior high school. So, um, Sarah J. Maas started. She didn't really start Romantasy. It's always been there. Like I say, Beauty and the Beast, Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, Tristan and Isolde, Romeo and Juliet. Although Romeo and Juliet isn't really fantasy, it's still, kind of in that genre. The Gothic novels of Anne Radcliffe, Wuthering Heights, those stories just lack the spice. And then, of course, the supernatural romance, the supernatural erotic novels that have been around for quite a while now still are cousins to what Sarah J. Maas is doing. But all of a sudden, someone was taking what were previously in modern popular culture Disney stories and turning them into some very adult books. And everybody loved them. Everybody went apeshit over this stuff. And it's selling like hotcakes. Um, the most recent two that I have read are Gothicana, which I felt I that one had it was very gothic. It felt a lot like Wuthering Heights. I think there's a lot of the secret history type story going on there, being at a university. I forget what they're calling that, but it also it's a fantasy and romance, but it's not fae. But it is a fantasy romance, and it does get spicy, and so that one I think fits very well. And I thought that was a very good book. And then Samantha got me to read this one. How does it feel? I've read this. I read the second volume, which just came out. I read it as an ebook when that was made available. And these go a lot farther with the intense um, graphic sexuality and violent sexuality. So, it's going further with that theme. These things, the Infatuated Face series is selling really well. And all these books, they're selling really well. Does that make them great? Not necessarily, but in having read them, they were good. They were enjoyable. So long as you can put up with the sexuality in them, so long as you can put up with the violence in some parts, they are enjoyable books. And the the thing you got to keep in mind with any genre is that is Sturgeon's law. Sturgeon's law. 90% of science fiction is crap, but then 90% of everything is crap. And it's real hard until you get that person that can come along and see the real possibilities of a genre and realize them into a great work of literature, you're wading through crap, hoping for that masterpiece to come along. But that it's, even though it may take a long time before somebody gets it, before it kicks in, clicks in, and somebody writes that great novel in a particular genre, the potential is always still there. Any story, any trope, any genre, any theme has the potential for just the right writer to come along and write that great book on that subject. So even if you're of the opinion that all this romantasy stuff so far is total garbage, that doesn't mean that somebody isn't going to come along and do something great with this. So you got to have a little bit of an open mind. You got to give it some time. You got to let somebody sit down and look at it. And it's not necessarily going to happen. There's no law that says that somebody definitely will write a romantasy masterpiece, but the possibility is there. The um, the genre just needs the right person to look at it the right way and write that right novel, and it's just going to be amazing. And I would rather try to be there when that happens than to just stand against the whole genre because it's, well, it's not Isaac Asimov, it's not Arthur Clarke. You know, don't be a snob. Don't turn your nose up at a genre just because it's a genre, just because it's aimed at a target audience that's not you, just because it's talking about things that you don't really have an interest in reading. Don't write the genre off as just pure garbage. Um, Leave your mind open that somebody might write something great. You still might not want to read it, but they still might write something great. And what we're seeing now with romantasy is we're seeing kind of a saturation point where there's just romantasy coming out of the woodwork. But a lot of it is just marketing. Okay. It's the big thing. It's the new hit. It's the stuff everybody's talking about and everybody wants. And so the marketers are going to look, the publishers are going to look for those romantasy books. The marketers are going to look for books where they can compare it to Sarah J. Maas or call it romantasy. And so you get books like this one. I just recently got this. I bought it mainly because the special edition of it is really cool looking. I love the illustration, love the painted edges, and just I wanted it. So I got it. And this story did sound kind of interesting with pirates and such. But it was kind of marketed as romantasy. I just watched a review on YouTube this morning about it, and they're saying there is romance, but it's a very small part of the story. So that's the other danger with a hot new genre like this is that marketers are going to try to stuff things into that because it'll sell better if they can sell it as romantasy. And it doesn't necessarily have much to do with the actual story. They may be kind of overselling it, and it's really a different type of story. And it's still, this is a YA book, and like I say, it's about pirates. It sounds good. And if it's not true, if it's not really romantasy, that's okay. It's still adventure and still um, sounds like a cool story. But you do have to be a little careful with the tendency of marketers to try to categorize something in a money making category, even though it doesn't really belong there. And until then, I'm going to keep my eyes open for that great work coming out of the romantasy genre. I think it's possible. It just takes the right author to look at it the right way and think the right way. And they may write it. Whether or not the publishers will publish it is another thing. The publishers are publishing money makers. They want money makers. They want to make money. They want to make lots of money. And there's a lot of authors that just aren't getting published because the publishers don't think they'll make enough money off of that author. And so those authors are forced into the independent publishing. Nothing wrong with independent publishing, though. It's out there, it's getting bigger, it has its own awards. People are starting to pay attention to it because they realize what's going on and they know that if they want to keep getting great science fiction, fantasy, horror, romance, whatever, but not just read the same three authors again and again and again, that they have to dip into the independence. And so that's a great area that is worth exploring. You're going to find all types of books, all genres of books in the independents. Yes, you're going to find, again, 90% of it is going to be crap. No, no getting around that. It's the 10% that we're in this for. And hey, among the 90%, sometimes those books, even though they're crap, they're kind of fun. So you can't be a snob about it. You got to go with just whatever's going to. This is entertainment. You got to go with whatever's going to be enjoyable to you, and forget all the snobbery. Forget whether or not it's your genre, or just forget all that and just go for good stories. Try to find the good and even great stories that are out there that you're going to enjoy, and that's your journey through literature. And I hope Telltale Books helps some people with at least part of that journey find their way to stuff that they're going to really love. And so I'm not going to ignore the romantasy category. Maybe my romantasy video, all of my romantasy videos have gotten very low numbers of views. I'm not going to stop doing them. I'm going to keep, mainly because of Samantha, I'm going to keep reading some of them. I'm not going to dive into every one that gets published because I don't have time for that. But I am going to try and pick out the best ones and see if they're going to live up to top tail status at all. Personally, I feel that those first two books of the Court of Thorns and Roses series, I think they deserve top tail status, not because they stand alongside David Copperfield or Don Quixote, but because they are fun books and they have revolutionized the fantasy publishing and created a whole new genre. Can't overlook that. And I did enjoy them. I really did enjoy them. The Throne of Glass series I have enjoyed, but I don't feel, they were her earliest works. And while they were instrumental in getting this ball rolling, I am enjoying them a lot, yes. I still don't feel they're as strong as the Akatar series. So, not giving those top tail status at all so far. We'll see. Maybe one of them will rise to that point. But the first four books that I've experienced from the Throne of Glass Ceylana series are just not quite there. Not for me. And I hope you'll indulge me in that. I'm gonna keep exploring a variety of literature, not just science fiction. I'm gonna get in. I read my first Western story, but it was a Michael Moorcock story. Okay, but I want to, and I do, to that end, have a copy of some Zane Grey books. It's an omnibus, and it has Riders of the Purple Sage, and I want to read that. And I want to read. I have read some mystery, but I haven't read any hard-boiled detective stories. Raymond Chandler, James Cain type stories. I want to try those too. So I want to get into some other genres. And I will report on all that stuff here. So that's plenty to have said about Romantasy. I'm going to play Romantasy a little low key, mainly because of what I said. You guys that are subscribed to us, you're not responding to it as well. So you will still see them, but I'm going to turn it down a little bit on those. Emily and I are going to explore cozy fantasy, though. That's something that when I started talking about this idea of exploring some of the new stuff and embracing romantasy a bit, I also mentioned cozy fantasy and legends and lattes, and she said, "Yeah, I have the book. I wanting to read it with a friend, but she dropped out on me, and so I want to read this book." And so yes, let's do that. So she's got that, some other cozy fantasies she's finding. We're going to delve into that new genre as well, because there again, the books are selling like crazy. Legends and Lattes, it's winning awards and just has lots of people swearing by it. We can't ignore it. It may be a future classic. So we got to read it and find out. I think that as reviewers, as people talking publicly about literature, I think that's an obligation that we dip our toes into it and not, ignore whole genres or whole new developments in literature just because we have a tendency to prefer 100-year-old lost classics. I will stop at that and let you go. Thank you for watching this, and thank you for sticking with Telltale Books through all the things we do. I'm not going to stop doing science fiction. That's my first love in literature and my strongest interest in literature, and I've got a lot more that I read in the past that I still want to get to and cover in videos. So much in so little time. And so hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, come on back and join me